I know I said I most likely wasn't going to make any more Genshin Court type of videos, but I did say that was because I didn't really see a point in them as the quality of information has increased and there was just too much to cover in Genshin. But currently there is literally nothing going on in Genshin right now, and after 6 months of enduring Clorine's misconceptions, I'd rather just not have to deal with that again. So I am going to be going over some Clorinde information, and I'll be dissecting Zejeff's video on her, as there is a lot to talk about regarding that video. Also, to preface, it doesn't matter at all that he called Clorinde the best mid character. If anything, with how strong the Pyro and Natlin meta is, which I predicted, I honestly think it's a compliment, but the community is obviously going to frame it as an insult, and I'll discuss the implications of that shortly. Before we do that, as always, if at any point during the video you are entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk on various topics regarding Genshin's meta and I'll try to keep you updated. Shout out to my channel members, I love you and appreciate the support, and with that, let's not begin, because I want to make the announcement now that if you want me to continue making these type of videos, where it does involve talking about a creator, please, I'm begging you, do not go out and harass the creator, otherwise I'll just take the video down and stop doing them. These videos aren't to start hate campaigns, it's a gacha mobile game, it's never that serious. It's just to correct community information so that people have the best knowledge about characters going into them, as these characters cost money or time, so it's best to have the information stated as accurately as possible. And now with that actually out of the way, let's start by talking about the take itself, or the general sentiment of the video being that Clorinde is the best mid character. As I just said, I think it's a pretty fair stance to take on Clorinde as a DPS. She doesn't reach the highest numbers in comparison to characters like the current Pyro or Hydro staples, and even if you were to look at other strong DPS like Kanich, Navia, or Chaska again, her raw numbers are generally lower compared to them, though at the very least, Clorinde makes up for this with the fact that she's archetypally very flexible, and has a range of teams bordering the top tier damage threshold, where most other carries or units kinda just have one team, or use the same units as other strong damage dealers. If you take a look at most of the attack scaler's best teams, it's currently Bennett Sitlali, Bennett Shilonin, or Bennett Malvika, or even two of them at the same time, and then outside of that they're just pretty average damage wise, which creates a saturation problem to where if you pull Navia and Kanich on the same account and want to use both of them, one has to take a hit in order for the other to shine, and an issue like that can never really happen with Clorinde, as she isn't heavily in demand for the best supports in the game, as you can just switch to using another Clorinde team archetype if one is in demand. So in a theoretical sense, if you look at her best teams compared to other characters' best teams, sure, make the claim that she's mid, but when accounting for her value and the fact that she will always ensure that your second team is as strong as it can reasonably be, that's where her value as a pull shoots up. She's kind of like an on-field Fischl in a way. Also, even though her team DPS numbers are lower, it's still within the upper tier of damage dealers regardless, so And speaking of the current meta or Abyss matchup, she's the best non-Chaska or Kanich counter to the Papilla type enemies, which cripples a lot of other characters. Unless the enemy is literally just immune or heavily resistant to electro damage, you can't really have a bad enemy matchup with Clorinde, which is why to me I'd very much recommend her as a pull. But now we have one piece of evidence, let's dive into Zejeff's video.
Her main three teams are going to be Chivalrous teams, Aggravate teams, and Hyperbloom teams. And here, I'm saying Hyperbloom teams, but if you're playing Hyperbloom teams, you're a lot more interested in the Quick Bloom teams that have good quicken up time.
We are not doing this. Quick Bloom Clorinde is a plague upon this community that needs to be vanquished, and I don't know why it's still being recommended over her EC teams, or even really considered one of her top teams. Let's break this down because I don't think people realize how much nothing Quick Bloom does for Clorinde. The first being that Clorinde innately has no reason to build EM, unlike other Quick Bloom one-fielders, or even actual dedicated Hyperbloom triggers. When you're using a Dendro on-fielder like a Hytham for Quick Bloom, then obviously he builds EM, his damage scales off of it, but at the same time your Electro units on those teams are Raiden or Kuki, who can go all in non-EM because they'd be doing no talent damage anyways. With Electro DPS like Cyno for example, Quick Bloom teams are different as the on-fielder is the one triggering the blooms, and they also most likely have to build and balance crit alongside any other damaging stats they want. Cyno gets innate EM scaling from his passive, and if you have his weapon, his EM gets converted to attack, so you have a reason to use an EM Sands and look for EM subs, as they are optimal for his talent damage as well as contributing to his Hyperbloom damage. And with the other Electro DPS for pure Quicken teams, an Elemental Mastery Sands ends up being better than attack for them, for their own talent damage due to Aggravate procs, and most of them also don't really do that much damage to begin with, so sacrificing it for stronger Hyperbloom triggers tends to be worth it, but not really in Clorinde's case. In attack sense, even on Quicken teams and with the amount of Aggravate procs she gets is still better than an EM Sands because of her A1 passive, and you don't get full Quicken uptime on Quick Bloom teams, so disregarding the blooms for this point, it would make building EM on her even worse for her own damage, but at the same time you have to build EM, otherwise you're adding the blooms on the team for no reason. But this isn't even the worst part. The best Clorinde Quick Bloom team, as Zejeff said, is with Nahida, Furion, and Fischl, and on this team you get like 7, 8 at most Hyper Blooms in a 17-second rotation. It's the one team I'd recommend TF Clorinde on just so you have less downtime before being able to trigger blooms again, as Fischl can't trigger blooms that consistently, so Clorinde has to be the trigger for the team. Overall, the team is just extremely dysfunctional and it loses to Aggravate and Chevreuse in single target, and is slightly better than EC in single target to just be infinitely worse in AoE compared to those 3 teams. You also basically just lose a unit in multi-wave, thank you so much Nahida. It just isn't a good team all around, and the damage it deals doesn't make up for it either. You don't even get the cheap benefit that you do with the Hyperbloom trigger like Kuki, because Clorinde still needs to balance crit stats anyways, so just play a better team please. Nahida and Furina are already on the team, just shifts to using EC or Aggravate.
You can also do stuff like some weird taser bullshit with Auron, but to me that's not particularly worth mentioning. Like, it works, you can do it if you like Auron, but it's not what I would gravitate towards.
I don't really know where this sentiment comes from at all. Taser is pretty inarguably alongside Chevreuse and Aggravate as the best Clorinde archetypes, especially after Auron and the minor 2k DPS increase it received from the transformative buffs. Also, Auron isn't needed for the team, the difference between them at equal constellations really isn't that massive. Regardless, it's better than fucking Quick Bloom. You just trade Nahida's EM buff, some Hyper Blooms that aren't doing too much damage anyways, to buffing all 3 characters that do damage on your team through Kazuha, Shilin, or Sucrose. And if you do use an Anemo unit, you have extremely comfortable AoE checks. Clorinde's top 3 teams are undoubtedly Aggravate, EC, and Overload.
Finale of the Deep best free-to-play sword for her, or is Calamity of Eshu better now that we got Lanyan? I haven't actually looked at any calcs for that, but I'm pretty sure Finale of the Deep is still going to be the best. Finale's just so good on her. But then there's also the fact that if you lose your shield because you got hit, you lose the buff from Eshu. So they're pretty much about as good as one another, but Eshu becomes dog shit if you lose a shield. I'd probably stick to Finale.
I feel like if you don't know, maybe don't give a definitive answer. But Calamity, if you're able to trigger the passive, is just better than Finale. The only caveat is, as Zijef said, that you can lose the shield which removes the buff, where you can never really lose Finale's buff. Although your shielders are Toma for Chevreuse or Quickburn, or Kirara for Aggravate, who are very good shielders, so I doubt you'd have a hard time upkeeping the passive. But if you just want to play Clorinde on any team without having to worry about what weapon you're using, just put on Finale. I agree with the general sentiment.
Why do you hate Clorinde's hat? It looks oversized and goofy. It looks like it's barely balancing on the top of her head. It looks like it's gonna fall off. It looks like it's gonna restrict her vision, and it's ugly.
Why are we doing personal attacks? Hope off my queen's hat. It makes sense. And compared to Lisa's or Mona's, we're calling this oversized?
There's the age-old Duke Lion Burst before or after your skill question, and the answer to that is you click on the button when it's purple. If the button is purple, you can use it. If not, then don't. That's kind of it. In terms of like simmed DPS, it tends to be better to use after, but Clorine's AoE is awful and worthless without her burst. And so in a lot of situations, you kind of just use the burst when the enemies are grouped, which tends to happen at the start of the rotation, not at the end. So just press the button when it's purple, who cares?
Of all the things to say about Clorinde, bad AoE is something I never thought I would hear. In fact, I would go as far as to say that Clorinde is one of the better AoE checks we have in the game, because of just how forgiving her hurt boxes are. Clorinde's attack radius is so generous that you're able to not even face an enemy, do her skill, and it will still hit enemies. You can play ring around a Rosie, right? You can play ring around a Rosie with an enemy while still getting hits on them. Or if enemies are semi-lined up, she has the same cone style AoE as Nufulet to where she can hit enemies all in front of her. And this applies to both her dashes and gunshots. A lot of characters kind of just don't have actual AoE without Kazuha, and in my experience, Clorinde thankfully isn't one of them. And I don't know how else to prove this other than just play the character or watch people play the character. Clorinde also has another upside in both AoE and multi-target, to where comparing her to Arlecchino, because she's mentioned a lot in this video, where Arlecchino will have to stop attacking to go towards enemies and attack if they ever get spaced out, or if they just spawn across the room. Clorinde not only has the range, but her movement is an attack window in itself, so you never really have to stop attacking with her in her damage window to worry about positioning, as she can continuously reposition herself, which is not something a lot of characters can do. Even Mualani with guaranteed AoE can struggle with multi-target because she just doesn't have that many hits, and her marking all enemies takes a bit of time, which is something Clorinde doesn't have to worry about. I just need to see Zijef playing Clorinde because I don't know what is going on with this take. Clorinde's AoE is one of her biggest upsides, and it's very consistent even without bursting.
For early constellations to be worth it, I've never considered constellations to be worth it, period, but like, I'm assuming you're asking like, how do they compare to other carries? They're fairly average. The biggest issue with her constellations is that Clorinde is not a character like Mawika or Arlecchino that deals the large majority of her team's damage. We can look at the damage distribution in these teams, right? So here, this is a official Channeling Chevaleur's team. Clorinde is doing a little bit over half the damage. Official with Toma, it becomes a little bit more than half because, well, Toma just has less damage and damage percent buff. All in on Clorinde personal damage, right? You get about 3/4. Right, 2/3, half, less than half, half. Anyways, the point being, there's quite a few of her teams where she's not doing that big of a portion of the team DPS.
Then don't play those teams. This point feels very disingenuous because you can literally do this with any carry ever in existence and then make the claim that their clones aren't worth it. Oh, would you look at this new Valette hyper carry team, he's only 64% of the team's damage. It just really isn't worth going for his constellations. Oh, you play Arlecchino Chevreuse? Well, guess what? She's only 68% of the team's damage. Don't go for her constellations. And if you are to put Arlecchino in the exact same Chevreuse team you put Clorinde in, their damage contribution is the same. Yes, if you have off-field damage dealers on your team, the damage distributions will be less centered on your DPS because there are other characters on the team doing damage. In New Valette's case, Farina is his best support while doing a ton of damage, so like you can't really do anything about it. But in Clorinde and Arlecchino's case, you can just shift the team to focus more on their damage. That's the solution. Here is a double Geo Clorinde's team that uses 3 buffers, and would you look at that, Clorinde is doing 91% of the team's damage. Or hell, let's look at this Aggravate team with Sara. She's again 3/4 of the team's damage. If you get damage-focused constellations on a character, you are going to want to use teams that bring out the character's damage more. The same way Fischl is better than Sara for C0 Raiden on hypercarry teams, but that changes when you get a C2 Raiden because buffing Raiden becomes a lot more important as she does more of the team's damage, so it outweighs Fischl's off-field damage. It feels very patronizing to explain this because I feel like this should just be mostly common sense if you're in the TC space.
Like, it's not a downside, but it's an upside she doesn't have. Other characters that can front-load damage can, at the same DPS, kill enemies earlier into a rotation because their damage comes out earlier. Whereas with Clorinde, that's not really the case. And then her AoE kind of sucks.
No! Stop with this narrative. Who has good AoE to you if Clorinde is somehow bad?
Is there any reason to get her over Arlecchino? Honestly, not really. The biggest upside that she has over Arlecchino is that she's less reliant on Bennett. But the thing is, in a team like this, I'd rather have Arlecchino over Clorinde in this slot, even without the Bennett. And I would say that, like, this archetype, like, with the flexible Electro slot, is probably her best team now. So that kind of weakens the argument to go for her.
I think if it feels Arlecchino is better than Clorinde in this slot, then that's completely fine. I'm not going to start theory crafting emotions. But you can't really use a subjective statement to make an objective claim about if you should pull Clorinde over Arlecchino because you personally like playing Arlecchino more. Theoretically, Clorinde is better than Arlecchino in this slot, and I would assume the same would be so in practice. And I just find it very hypocritical, not just the Jeff, but a lot of people in general will say that Clorinde is not worth pulling because Arlecchino is better. Brother, who was on the banner not even a month ago, who dominates Arlecchino in her role, while also being a very competent sub-DPS and enabling the Natlin national team core, which has been steaming through the meta. You really can't make the argument that Clorinde isn't valuable because she isn't the best DPS on the banner, but then turn around and say that Arlecchino is still valuable when she's in direct competition for the best DPS in the game currently. That just seems very hypocritical. And just to make it clear, I think Arlecchino is still a character worth pulling for because there are people who don't want Mawika or are going to primarily use her as an off-field DPS. I just think the arguments against pulling for Clorinde because Arlecchino is better makes no sense when Clorinde is currently more valuable in her team options than arguably any other DPS right now. That's gonna be it for Zajeff's video. There's nothing else that is really like actual misinformation. The rest of the video is pretty spot on. And one last thing I want to talk about regarding Clorinde, which wasn't said in the video, but I know a lot of the community really does hold the sentiment, and it's essentially Clorinde's Fischl reliance. Currently, Clorinde really isn't that reliant on Fischl anymore. And can we stop pretending like being reliant on Fischl and being reliant on Bennett are the same thing, because I've heard some people seriously make the argument. Fischl is still generally Clorinde's best teammate, but Auroron exists who is just as good if not better than Fischl if you're using him on Mawika Chevreuse teams or EC teams. Sara only at C6 can also supplement Fischl pretty well even on Aggravate teams if your Clorinde is well enough invested. She currently isn't a Fischl or die character anymore, but the memes are extremely funny. So, but with that, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on Clorinde, as I'd love to hear and respond to almost every single comment. Channel members, I love you and appreciate your support. It means the world to me. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.